called Send Help. He's the coordinator of the campus at Wayne College down in the Holmes County branch. I like to think of him as a friend. Probably one of the most patriotic people that I know. And without further ado, John Lorson.
I'm going to borrow your clipboard here, Bob. Thank you for the introduction. I'm flattered that Bob would suggest that I'm one of the most patriotic people that he knows, because I look out here and I see a whole lot of people just like me. And I got a call on my way home. I was riding home from Millersburg one day, and it was a number I didn't recognize. And when I got to the little park in Fredericksburg, I checked my voicemail, and it was Pat Carpenter. And Pat had called at Bob's suggestion and asked me if I'd speak here today. And so for the rest of the ride, as I often do, I thought about that and I deeply pondered it. And you know, my first thought was, well, you know, I'm not a veteran. Will that work? Is that going to be okay? And I asked Pat that when I called. It's the first thing I told her, and she said, yeah, I think that'll be okay. And I ran the idea by my wife. I said, you know, I've been invited to speak at the Memorial Day ceremony in Marshallville, and she said, do you really think you can do that? And I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, I've seen, do you think you can get the whole way through that without falling apart? Because she's seen me many times recount tales that I've read or heard about bravery and acts of valor and the sacrifice that our servicemen and women go through so we can stand here on a day like this, a beautiful spring day, as free people. And I decided that, you know what, it was going to be tough to make it through this. And I needed to do that. It's the very least I can do. It's the very least any of us can do. Last year at Orville's ceremony, my daughter Sylvia is a student at Orville High School, and she was asked to read in Flanders Field. And you know, those of us that partake of this kind of thing, those few of us, have heard that poem many, many times, and some of us know that it was written by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. Very few people know after that the story of how it was written. And Lieutenant Colonel McCrae was a very interesting character. He was a physician in Guelph, Ontario, and also a poet. And he enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force at the age of 41 years old. And as a physician, and considering his age, he could have very easily gone into the medical corps, but instead chose to be a gunner in a battle battalion and went to the front lines of World War I. And after the Battle of Ypres is when he wrote this poem. That was one of the first times that the Germans used chlorine gas in the trenches. And that battle raged for 17 days straight. He wrote in a letter to his mother that for 17 days and nights they were never out of their clothes, they were never out of their boots, and the gunfire never ceased for longer than 60 seconds. At the end of it all, very near the end of it all, he and one of his very close friends, or he lost one of his very close friends, and he buried him. And as he buried him, he realized, looking out over the field in Flanders, that those that had died earlier in that same battle, their graves were already being covered by poppies. And that's how poppies came to represent those that are fallen. And in a way, it represents the way in which life must go on and the battle must go on, in spite of the fact that we've lost so many brave souls. My father, Charles Lorson, served in World War II, and he'd be infinitely proud to see me standing here right now. Patriotism is a trait that's learned by observation and practice. And And if we don't see people doing this kind of thing, if children don't see people doing this kind of thing every year, that'll be lost. You know, Memorial Day was created in 1868, shortly after the Civil War, in which every single person in this nation, North and South, had a direct connection to the war. They lost someone in their family, they lost a husband, a brother, a spouse. It was easy to recognize the peril of war when it was right in their own backyard. You know, here we are 150 years removed from that moment, and it's not so easy to remember what goes on every single day in other parts of the world. And it's important to relay that message to our children. And I'm so happy to see so many kids out here today. Thank you to the band today. Thank you to our speaker today, because I know that you understand these things. Many people don't. Many people wouldn't understand why we all stand here today listening to a guy like me talk about the bravery of people who died for us. I think that if you went over to the Walmart parking lot right now and asked people to define freedom and how we got it, you'd have a tough time finding an answer. It shouldn't be that way. One day of remembrance a year isn't enough. I think that we should take some time every day to really remember, to consider the small things in our life that other people in other parts of the world that do not live in free countries cannot do. Just the smallest of things. You know, for the 15th year here, just last week, I finished up teaching junior achievement to third grade classes in Orville. For 5 weeks every year, for a couple hours a day, I get to be a third grade teacher. And my unit in third grade and junior achievement, if there are any of my students out there, is called Our City. And it's a bit of an introduction to civic duty and what goes on in a city. And one of the things that I love to do, and I've done this since the very beginning, and it's not in the lesson plan, is I love to right away get those kids to realize that they play a very important role in the action of that city. Each one of them plays a role in the action of that city. And how do I get them to do that? By the very most basic gift of our democracy. We have a vote. You know, in 15 years, I have 100% voter participation in the third grade. And I would suggest that across this country, that if you held a vote in every third grade class all across the country on anything, I don't even care what it is, you would never find someone abstaining from that vote. You know, what happens on the way to adulthood that makes people forget about that? That makes people no longer realize the importance of that vote and what it took to win the opportunity for that vote. Last year, in the midterm elections, was the lowest voter turnout since World War II. 36.4% of eligible voters actually took the time out of one day a year to go out and exercise the most fundamental task and duty of a democracy. That stuff's got to change. And as I said in the first place, patriotism, civic duty, that all starts with us. Everyone here that hears this message, you have the opportunity to influence children. Make sure you do it. You know, my mom worked at the polls when I was a kid, and I used to stay up and wait for her to come home at night, and I'd watch the election results on TV. I was kind of a weird kid. I mean, I admit that. But it was always very important to me. I couldn't wait for that opportunity to grow up one day and vote. We need to remind kids that that's it. That's what we do, you know? If that's the only task that they partake of in preserving our democracy, at least they're doing that. Because for us to continue as a free nation, we need to all participate. You know, the greatest honor and the greatest gift that we can bestow on those who have fallen and those who serve now is for us that are here at home to make sure they don't come home to a mess. They're fighting for a free country, the one that they left behind, the one that they are working to preserve. And the framers of our Constitution knew that through time things would change. That's why they gave us a Congress, a body to make laws, to see the need for change and to change it, and to fix the things that were broken. Dr. Martin Luther King gave us a great tool. He taught us that civil disobedience is a way to start the flame to enact change. But civil disobedience and violence are vastly different things. And we need to constantly remind ourselves that the mechanism for change is right here. We've had it all along since the beginning of this country. We vote, we champion a cause, we work, we help each other, we find problems and we solve them. We don't burn down cities, we don't go crazy. We preserve the United States. Our soldiers, sailors, Marines, those who have died and those who are serving right now, they're the champions and the guardians of liberty, but we're its keepers. The ones who stay behind. We're the ones who need to make sure that what they come home to is a place of honor and a place that they have worked to preserve. My father would also be very proud, and this is one of those, I guess one of those signals that you're doing things right and teaching your kids patriotism. Right now, and I love to look out here and see my brother and my sister, the three of us together each have a child that's serving in the military right now. My nephew Jeremy is a Marine captain. My nephew Scott is a first lieutenant in the Air Force, and my daughter Charlotte is a second lieutenant in the Army. And I think that if you ask each one of those kids, you know, what was the great inspiration to you? Where did it all start? I think they'd probably look back to Grandpa Chuck and say, that's the guy. You know, the guy who served in World War II. And my dad was really just one of the most patriotic people that I ever knew or met. And it bothered him to look out at a country that he seemed, even 20, 30 years ago, that seemed to him like it wasn't honoring folks the way that it should. And I'm so proud that my nieces and nephews, or nephews and my daughter actually serve today. You know, this opportunity to speak comes at a really interesting time for my daughter's mother, my wife Kristen over there, and I. We just found out last week from Charlotte that she'll be leaving on her first overseas deployment here by the end of summer. And you know, it's Kristen's job. I'm going to avoid looking at her. It's Kristen's job to worry, and it's my job to remind her that Charlotte's part of the most highly trained, respected, and well-equipped fighting forces in the history of the world. And in that her fellow soldiers, she trusts in them, they trust in her, and that everything will be okay. That's what I try to say.
Okay.
But at the same time, I worry as well. You know, I can't help but think about First Lieutenant Ashley White Stump. She was a graduate of Marlington High School and Kent State University. Very much the same career path as my daughter Charlotte. She was a member of the North Carolina National Guard, and she was part of a cultural support team that was actually deployed with a special operations force in Afghanistan. And she had a unique job in the military. And many women now in the military do. There's a way in which they can serve that a man actually cannot, especially in our areas of conflict that we're involved in now. The in the culture of Islam, a woman can't speak to a man, but a woman can speak to a woman, and oftentimes they readily will. So they knew as they went out on these missions, on these special operations missions, that they couldn't speak to women, but if they had a woman with them, they could. And Ashley White Stump volunteered for that duty, and she was killed when an explosive device blew up while she was on one of these night missions and killed her and 2 of her fellow soldiers. Obviously, it's a dangerous world out there, and it's dangerous for every single one of our soldiers, men and women. But I'm confident in knowing that our armed services are highly trained and ready, every single one of them, to stand in the way of the destruction of our democracy. What they're doing there is absolutely as important to us as the folks that fought for the Union in preserving the United States of America. And we need to make sure that we send that message forward to our kids. In closing, I'd like so much, and I don't even know what I can possibly say, to thank those who have lost a loved one in service to this country. I don't even know where to begin, but I'll pledge to you that every time I have the opportunity to thank a service member, to thank someone who has lost someone in war, I'll do that. And I hope that all of you will too. I thank you all for the opportunity to let me speak here today. It's the greatest honor I've ever had in my life. And I hope that we can all remember the words of Abraham Lincoln when he says that, you know, the words that we say here today won't be remembered for long. And I'm paraphrasing Lincoln here. He's much more eloquent than I will ever be. The words we say here today won't be remembered long, but what they gave needs to be and will be remembered forever. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, John.